tornado.
Come
If
on,
you get hit by a
Josh.
tornado,
Come on.
then just
You
let it
guys
go.
are such pros. You got your books behind you showing off. I'm just sitting there dirty old
That's true.
office.
That's true. That's just that we started the show and Kevin J. Anderson said we were pros. That's a good way to start. Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to another episode of Live here on Keystroke Medium. I am Josh Hayes here with my co-host Scott Moon, and tonight Kevin J. Anderson joins us to talk about his books, his writing life, and everything that went along with that. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's better than watching TV at night. Well, maybe not, depending on what time.
I know it's way better than watching TV at night.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Game of Thrones is over as of last night, so I can do a podcast tonight.
Yeah,
That's
and you can't go on the Facebook for like 3 more days because people will be arguing about it, and you just gotta stay away.
3 more days, boy, you're optimistic.
Yeah,
I am. The great thing about this show is everybody spoils it like right after it's over. We don't want to. Everybody spoils Keystroke right after the show. They don't wait for the whole grace period like you're supposed to wait.
Right.
Everybody in the live chat, thank you guys for coming and hanging out with us this Monday night. Not really necessarily a spoiler warning, but a show warning. There's a really big storm going on right now in Wichita, and so if either Scott or I just completely freeze up and go robotic, and
then we're probably literally
talking.
Yeah, then
show must go on.
Whoever's still on the show, just keep talking, and it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
We'll literally be in Oz, probably off to see the wizard.
Okay.
That's right. That's
Our houses will be spiraling through the stratosphere.
You mentioned in your email in the post show that your newest book, Spine of the Dragon, is coming out on June 4th. It's a new fantasy series by you. And obviously you've written a crap ton of books over the last 31 years of your career.
I think it'd be really cool if you had like a book you could hold up to the camera.
Really?
Show it.
Oh, he's got a book he can hold up.
Drops. And actually, I think this is a pretty nifty cover. I mean, it's big type and my name in big letters and just kind of a nice little sword and dragon scales. And the book publishing now, and I guess we'll be talking about indie publishing and everything. Book cover design requires more than just a painting of 2 guys with swords fighting a dragon with flames going off.
Well, absolutely.
You got to have something cooler, and I like the cover of that. And that one, Spine of the Dragon, it's the first in a trilogy I'm planning, but that story keeps getting bigger and bigger. So who knows what it's going to be. It's published by Tor Books. It's one of my, I'm a hybrid author. So I indie publish a lot of my titles, and I also still work with my traditional publishers. And that's in hardcover and audiobook and ebook. And I worked about 2 years on it. This is my big thing. I kept this. I was brought up as an author being trained to write these gigantic, massive 200,000 word things like Game of Thrones. Only I'm actually going to finish my series.
Challenge accepted.
Lots and lots of storylines and characters and huge complicated plots going on. And now the market, I really, if I were indie publishing this, I would have published 3 70,000 word books for the same length of that one, and I would bring them out every 4 months or something like that.
Do a trilogy. You can get
but I did. They were kind of getting off on a tangent here, but I turned in this 200,000 word book to Tor, and they were kind of agonizing about how massive the book would be and how high the cover price would have to be, and I said, well, there's this gigantic climax right in the middle. Why don't I split it into 2 100,000 word books? I'll rewrite it a little bit, and then you can release one book, and then 6 months later release the next book. And they said, well, we could maybe do that, but they'd still be a year apart. And Tor is a terrific publisher. I've been with him for so many titles, but if I break it in half and they still only publish them a year apart, then I don't think that would have served the purpose. I prefer to keep it in just one big, massive volume. But that's the difference, I think, between indie who can produce it and get it out right now as soon as you get it done, and traditional publishing, which has a much more sedate's maybe not the word I'm looking for, but there's a lot more planning and a lot more catalog and reviews and releases, and it just takes a lot longer.
A lot of moving parts, it seems like.
Well, and they do things that indie publishers can't do a lot. I mean, it's a lot harder for somebody who's doing a Kindle Unlimited 50,000 word military SF thing to get a gigantic window display in Barnes and Noble. I mean, it's a different kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm curious then, you've done Star Wars, you've done Dune, you've done your Saga of Stars and all those things. Now you're back to fantasy. What you said, this is kind of your, I hate to use the word magnum opus, but it's your thing. It's your big thing that you've been planning on. And let's talk about it for a little bit. What about this story is what you're trying to tell to the audience that you haven't done in your other books?
Yeah. Well, I did a giant space opera called Saga of Seven Suns, and then I did a sequel called The Saga of Shadows. So that's 10 books total, and then I did a couple of a prequel and a sequel. So that's 12 books and a graphic novel, gigantic space opera that I did. And I also did the huge Dune series with Brian Herbert, Frank Herbert's son. And we did mini trilogies and stuff in that one. And we kind of wrapped up the Dune stuff the same time I wrapped up the Seven Suns series. And I decided to switch to fantasy. I had already done my Terra Incognita trilogy and some other fantasies. And this is how I wanted to kind of jump back into doing something original. And fantasy allows you to deal with, well, I guess I should say that as a reader and a writer, I look at the story and the characters and not so much the genre. And a giant epic story, I mean, if you really strip it down, Dune is a big epic fantasy story.
I was about to ask that.
I mean, the way it's all set up with nobles and kings and dukes and emperors and things, you could change the setting and the same story would be pretty much a fantasy story. So I don't worry too much about the genre. This time I wanted to do fantasy, but it is. And I read all the Game of Thrones books as they came out, so which wasn't hard if they're 12 years apart. But
just read like half page a day.
But I also love Lord of the Rings and I really love Robin Hobb. I don't know if you've read any of her stuff. She's the Live Ship Traders and the Assassin's Apprentice. I really love those things. And I've got this. It's just this huge epic story where I believe that like the story itself is the main character, where you've got kings and foot soldiers, and you got monsters and assassins and evil priests, and it's basically it's a fantasy world where it's two continents at war. It's if you want to think of it as like Christian Europe versus Muslim Arabia. It's two continents that hate each other and they're at war. And then this ancient race comes back that wants to destroy the world so it can be remade in a perfect form. And to do that, they have to wake the dragon that's in the center of the earth. And so we've got this ancient race that's at war with each other, and they're trying to enlist the aids of the humans, and the humans are trying to kill each other. And because I have a very dim view of the human race as a whole, because I think we always shoot the wrong target and pick the wrong enemies and don't focus on the. Remember like all those old well, they're not that old. The movies were like the asteroids hurtling toward the Earth, and all the nations on Earth get together to find a way to stop it. And I'm going,
right?
No, they wouldn't. They'd argue about the environmental impact statement for the next 7 years as the asteroids hurtling.
You blasting each other on Twitter about.
Yeah, they would argue about that. So but this has got magic and monsters and dragons and really evil. Well, one of the really, really cool things I've got is that there's enough magic in the world that we've got this entire continent where the people. You remember, like in the old Greek legends, where they thought that there was a local god of the waterfall and a goddess of the mountain here and there. Well, if you got these people that believe that there's this protective deity that's there watching over them, and there's enough magic in the land, and they believe strong enough that the magic actually makes their beliefs manifest. And so they see this little godling that appears because they believe in it. So then they believe in it more, so it gets stronger. So then they sacrifice to it, so it gets stronger. And then they believe in it more. So they kind of create their own gods in this circular thing.
That's kind of how Keystroke Medium started, really.
Yeah. So
I knew I'd get Josh right there.
Right when he was drinking too, right?
Yeah. Perfect timing.
So I mean, it's one of those where give me a one sentence summary of the Game of Thrones. Well, you can't. It's just huge, giant story, and that's what I'm trying to to build with Spine of the Dragon.
People are bad and they all kill each other.
Yes.
One sentence
Something
summary
like
of Game
that.
of Thrones.
The one sentence summary of Game of Thrones is ice
all-
zombies in a geopolitical battle.
Or you're all going to die because you deserve to die.
Yeah.
That's right.
Or I would say 7.5 seasons of telling us the threat of this giant army of ice zombies that all ends in one episode in one battle.
True, that checks out.
Very quickly. Can confirm. Can confirm.
I figure I can do a little bit of a spoiler because that was like 3 episodes ago. So
yeah, that's in the safe zone. It's like kind of like yellow.
Yes.
area.
Well, I think that if you spend all of 5 minutes scrolling through Twitter or Facebook, you'll be instantly spoiled with what's
Yeah.
what's going
Well,
on.
I still haven't even seen Avengers Endgame yet, so I'm just a lost cause on that. So
Avengers
it's
Endgame
busy
was
to watch for 3 hours. So.
If you want, we can spoil it for you right after the show's
Yeah,
over.
thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks,
no
I
problem.
appreciate that.
Let's circle back around. We were talking about.
Oh, we were talking about significant stuff. Yes, sorry, we
Right.
got off on a.
It's all right. That's what we do.
Well, actually, that brings up a good point. And if this is the first book in a trilogy,
Right.
do you and in your writing process as you go about creating, do you know how this book is going to end? Do you have like this grand epic thing that you're trying to reach, or are you just kind of seeing where the story takes you?
Well, I'm pretty much an inveterate plotter. I like to outline everything that I'm doing, and in fact, I really ruthlessly outline the book as I'm writing it. I have, sometimes my outlines are 40 single space pages long. I mean, it's every single chapter with a couple of paragraph description, and that's the book itself that I've got going. But when I originally created the Spine of the Dragon, the series, I've read all the Terry Goodkind sort of truth books, and I've read some of the Robert Jordan ones and Brandon Sanderson and his Mistborn stuff. I kind of like the idea of building a fantasy world so huge with so many characters that you can just keep writing stories in it. I mean, if you spend so much time developing everything and then you do book 1, book 2, book 3, we're done.
Right.
And when you have that much invested, like with my Saga of Seven Sons, that was 7 novels long covering this huge arc. And I can wrap this up in 3 books I guess what we'll do is we'll look at the sales of book 2 and I'll decide, okay, do I kill everybody or not? And, obviously as a writer, what I would like is that they all sell millions of copies so that I just write 12 of them. But,
right.
You can't. And the problem is with traditional publishing, the time frame is so extended that I kind of need to be writing book 3. Well, I need to pretty much finish book 3 before book 2 even comes out. And so I won't know how book 2 sells. So we kind of basically have to base all of it on how well book 1 does. And, I would love to have a series that would keep going and keep readers coming back to. But on the other hand, if it's not paying the bills, I don't want to be stuck writing 12 books under contract if nobody wants to read them. But I'm a very prolific author and I write a whole bunch of different things at once. And but right now, this is Spine of the Dragon is kind of my big passion. And
that's an interesting difference between being hybrid or traditional published, having a contract where, if you're doing it all yourself and it's not going, you can just bail out.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there is the difference. I mean, for those of us, I have made my living at writing for the past 30 some years, and making a living means you have to pay the bills. And if you have to pay the bills, you kind of want to get some money up front. And that's what traditional publishers do, is that they you sign a contract and they pay you in advance, and that supposedly allows you to live for the 2 weeks it takes to write the book, or longer.
Well, however long it takes.
Depending on what the advance is, it might be only 2 weeks. But but that is one of the reasons why I would sell a multiple book deal to a traditional publisher, because they pay money up front and then they devote their editors and their art directors and their copy editors and their marketing department. And I help with all the marketing, but they have their own department to do it. Whereas if I'm going to write it indie, I don't get a penny until the thing is all done, after I've already paid for the cover art and paid for the proofing and the editing and whatever else. I don't pay for the editing because I married my very best editor, but that's
good call.
Not everybody can do that. But that's a different thing. I mean, once you get your indie machine rolling, and if you're Michael Anderle and you have 796 books out a year or something like that,
right?
And then the money's rolling in. Well, then you can keep priming the pump. But there's a point. Now, for me, the transition was the hardest part because I'd always been traditionally published, but then I started doing a bunch of my books indie by reprinting all of my old backlist and then doing some original things, and transitioning from getting money up front to pay your bills to the point where you don't make any money until sometime in the future after you've already paid all your expenses and published it. That's a big gap between those two things. And so, you hope you have a rich uncle die somewhere in the middle, somewhere like that.
It happens.
Well, that's actually kind of the reverse that I'm trying to do, and I've talked a lot about it on the show and other interviews. Is trying to diversify where my money is coming from as a writer, and so like I'm indie published now, and I do a lot of collaborations, which I want to talk about as well. But I'm also interested in getting a traditional deal. So like you said, you can on some books you could get advances, on some books you get paid after it's done.
Right.
And the interesting thing I think is that with indie, like you say, you can pump these books out and continue to produce, but also on the traditional side where you have that slow production schedule where you turn in a book, it could be a year from the time you turn it in to the time they publish it. And during that time, you could still be pumping indie titles out and different things. So that I'm very interested in doing that.
Right. Well, and one of the things I'm just writing a book right now with Martin Shoemaker. It's a nonfiction book on it's called On Being a Dictator. Because how I write, all of my writing is with this Olympus handheld recorder, digital recorder. Excellent. I do all of my writing that way. I go out hiking and I dictate it. And Martin has an hour-long commute each way to work, and he turns his hour-long commute each day into writing 5,000 words. And he dictates as he drives. And if so many people have asked us about this that we decided to write, it's like a 20,000 word book on the process of dictation and transcription services and software and all that sort of stuff. But it took us like a week and a half to write, and it's going into our proofing team right now, and I can have it published next week. I mean, that's how you can do it. That's how fast you could do it. If I sold this to like Writer's Digest books and they would release it, it would be a year and a half from now before you'd see it. And I literally asked Martin, we were at the Writers of the Future ceremonies in LA in April. I said, hey, we should do this book on dictation. And we did a couple of emails with our table of contents and which parts I would write, which parts he would write. And I dictated my chapters while I was driving to and from like Starbucks in the morning, and he dictated his, and we sent them back and forth, and we edited them. I edited mine on the plane flying home from Las Vegas last night, and it's ready to go. And I've got the cover art with some stock art, and I've got a designer who's going to put it all together, and we'll get it. I mean, this will be a book that will probably do fairly well because I don't know that there's any other popular books on dictation for writing out there, and it's a pretty it's a very innovative thing. You get your productivity, and we'll have the book out, and that instant gratification is cool.
We've talked about dictation a lot on the show, and we've even had several YouTube episodes where we're showing what we're doing, or we're talking about dictation. But I don't know, like you said, that there's actually been a book written on it. But you touched on a little bit. You had the idea in April. You spent a couple of months working on it, and you publish it. Weeks. But like you said, if you were to send it to someplace else and it takes a year and a half to publish, well, by then it could be not relevant at all by the time it comes out. So it's this pushing it out early and punctually, if you will, makes it relevant and keeps it relevant, so you can keep putting stuff. I'd be very interested to read that book.
Definitely interested in looking at that book, even just to know like what that recorder is that you held up. That's an Olympus. Is it?
It's an Olympus. It's an Olympus. They don't put the model number on the front of it, so Here, that's what it looks like.
Okay, cool.
It's
We're down to Best Buy.
There's it's a DSS something. It's a sorry, it's a high-end one because I just run them into the ground. I mean, I'll probably write 20, 30 novels on that recorder before it's dead. And of course, it's hard to dictate when you're coughing.
I think you write a book about coffee.
There we go. But it's, I mean, I dictate my audio files. I upload them to the transcription service. Some human types it, and I get a Word file back probably within a day. And, you know, that way I can go out hiking. Of course, today it was cold and snowing, and I was trudging around. I was covered with white by the time I finished because it was wet, heavy snow.
It's only May, right? Yeah, we got some pretty nasty cold.
But I'm in Colorado, so.
Yep.
But I got 2 chapters in the sequel to Spine of the Dragon written, so.
That's what I was going to ask. So I do a little bit of a hybrid dictation where I kind of type some of the narrative, but especially with dialogue, I'll speak it and then it'll put it into my Scrivener document. But you actually just walk around and speak the entire story. Do you do entire novels like that, or do you actually ever sit down and type on the keyboard? I mean, obviously when you're editing, but.
Well, I edit at the keyboard the whole time, and that's kind of you're stuck in the office staring at the screen editing. But my creative brain works best when I'm out walking. And again, I live in Colorado, so I'm hiking in the Rocky Mountains, and I've got trees and waterfalls and snow all over me sometimes. But sorry, getting over con crud from Marcon last weekend. But that's the way I feel like I'm inspired the most. And there's been lots of studies, Stanford, Psychology Today, there've been a couple other ones where they've proven that walking improves your creativity, that you get more ideas and more inspiration when you're out walking. And so I really hate to just be stuck with my butt in the chair. I like to be out kind of walking and get into that zone and just be fighting my dragons or whatever I'm writing that day.
Do you always get to a point where sometimes I feel when I'm dictating, and I'm sure for you, since you've been doing it for so long, it's kind of second nature, but I have a disconnect between my mind and what I'm saying, because normally in my normal writing mode, the information goes from my brain to my fingers, and I type that into the computer. And sometimes talking, I sit there and I'm just wordless for like minutes trying to think of what I'm going to say. How did you get past that, or what's your normal? Do you just walk around and just talk, and how much of it do you keep?
Well, I mean, but of course, I've been doing this for decades. Remember,
sure.
I've done 130 novels this way. Just it comes more naturally to me to be speaking it. Sometimes I'm sitting there at the keyboard and I freeze up because I'm like, in fact, literally, I had to for the dictation book. There's an example for the dictation book. Just 2 days ago, I had to get the cover designer working on it, and so I wanted to do the cover copy. Well, the cover copy's 150 words or something like that, and I sat there staring at my laptop, and I went, "I'm going to go out for a walk." So I took the recorder, went out and walked for like 5 minutes, and dictated the stuff, and came back in and transcribed it. Just because it was hard for me to get all the pieces together by staring at the screen. It just had to come out of my mouth, I guess. So.
We were talking about that today, Josh and I, on the phone about different, like because he was taking notes, making notes by hand on paper versus typing versus dictating. All three of those, I think, kind of engage you differently in a creative sense. So
there have been times when just trying to, like, I'm going to start a 200,000 word book. I've got to sit down and, like, just today figure out what book 2 is going to be all about. Sometimes in cases like that, I do like to sit with a notepad and a pen or pencil and just kind of mull it over and sketch out some broad strokes and draw arrows and circle things. And it's just, there's no, I'm sure you guys have said this on the show many times, but I mean, there's no right way to do it. It's not, that's not like a surgeon's handbook. I mean, there's a right way to do an appendectomy, but there's not a right way to plot a novel. It's whatever works for you.
Yep. Josh, do you
Right.
want to grab that question from Ken?
Yeah, well, there's two actually. One came a little earlier from Barta today, who asks, you mentioned a transcription service. Can you say what service you use, or do you just do it on the computer?
Oh, no. I in fact, that's one of the whole sections about this On Being a Dictator book, is that Martin uses Dragon Naturally Speaking and has it trained and does all of that. I use a human transcription service just because I've always preferred humans, because they know the difference between there, and there. And when I'm dictating, I don't want to say new paragraph, open quote, capital P, blah, 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 period, or exclamation point, close quote, comma. I'm just telling the story like somebody's listening to an audiobook. And when I say, Josh, you want to take that one? No, Scott, you take it. All right, Kevin, I'll answer it. That's three different people talking, and there's
Right.
different paragraphs, and the transcriptionist knows that, whereas Dragon would just put it all in a big block. But it all depends on what you use, and of course the transcription service costs you money. It's about a penny a word. So a 5,000 word short story, I'll have to pay $50 to get it transcribed. This 200,000 word novel I'm writing right now costs me $2,000 to get transcribed. I'm making more than $2,000 on the novel, so that's
Right.
that's worthwhile. But not everybody is. I mean, if you're starting out as a brand new author, you might only make $2,000 on your first novel or something like that. So it all depends on what you're doing. The service that I use is called WeScribeit, W-E, and then Scribeit, S-C-R-I-B-E-I-T, WeScribeit.com. And it's a small, I don't know, they've got a half dozen typists, and remember, what these people do for a living is they're transcribing lawyer dictations and doctor's notes and all kinds of boring stuff, and they go nuts when I send them a vampire novel, because this is like interesting stuff. And in fact, it's almost like I'm like doing a Charles Dickens serial, because I've got like this typist will turn things around in hours, because she wants to figure out what's going to happen next. So she gets, it's like me reading the story every day. And in fact, I had one. It's a vampire serial killer novel called Stake, like a wooden stake. And that audible.com is doing as one of their originals. And I was writing it in November. And I always do like 2 chapters a day. My chapters are 2,000 words, 2,500 words, something like that. And like every morning I'd go out for a walk, I'd dictate 2 chapters, and I'd upload them to the service. And by like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd come back all done. And now they guarantee like a 3-4 day turnaround time. But on Thanksgiving Day, she turned things around in like 2 hours. So that's a good sign, because they want to know what's going on.
She's probably glad to get away from the family. I have to work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because that brings up a separate question in so drafting. How many, like I normally go through 1 or 2 drafts. I kind of do a snowflake method ish, where I'll write bits of chapters and then expand on those bits, and then by the time I get by 3 or 4 passes, I've got a full chapter out, and then I pretty much do that through the whole story, from beginning to end, to go back again. So with you for this, if you're dictating, let's just say for the sake of argument, 5,000 words, you send it off, you have it transcribed, it comes back. Is that your first draft that you then go back and change and edit and do different things? Do you retranscribe or redictate the changes and then send it back for that? How does the process work for that?
Oh no, it's when I dictate it, that's a real draft. I mean, and from that point on, it's literally just polishing.
Okay.
It's cleaning up the sentences, typing things. One of the drawbacks with dictation is you often do repeat stuff. Like, did I say this before or not? And you can't remember. And so there's the first draft takes a lot of cleanup. So I'm dictating it. So that's theoretically the first draft. And then I'll edit it once. And that's kind of the using a dull machete through the jungles of the Yucatan, trying to get through the prose. Right. And that's the hardest part. And then I go over it again and again. It's usually maybe like 5 drafts before it's it's turned in. Now, what I'm doing, the sequel to Spine of the Dragon is called Venge War, like Revenge War. And right today, I wrote chapters 73 and 74 out of 100. I've got it all mapped out, so I know it's going to be 100. So I'm 3/4 of the way through, wrote 73 and 74, and they all come back that very same day from the typist. And this afternoon, so I do my writing in the morning, and this afternoon I edited the machete with the spoon kind of thing. I edited chapter 30 and 31. So I'm kind of slowly working myself behind. So I'm editing chapter 30 and I'm writing chapter 74.
Interesting.
Because I hate doing all of the editing at once because it's so hard.
Yeah.
And this way I'm at least I'm doing the fun part, which is the writing in the morning, and then I'm doing the editing, which is the hard part in the afternoon.
Yeah, I always know when Scott's editing because my phone usually heats up, like my battery heats up because Scott's editing, and he's very mad. And
it depends
his
on whether
anger.
Depends on whether I'm editing my own stories or somebody else's. Because my own, it's a little more of a labor of love, and I know what I'm trying to do in the revisions. But when somebody else for somebody in a collaboration, they send something back, and you have to interpret what did they want, what did they see that needed to be different, or yada yada.
Well, and then let's emphasize to the people listening here that collaboration doesn't mean that you each do half of the work. Collaboration means you each do 90% of the work. So, I mean, it really is that you spend. It's a lot harder to edit somebody else's stuff than to just write it yourself in the first place. Well, I think so, at least. But I've done a lot of collaborating, and and you come up with a book that's just not something that I could have written, and that's the advantages of it. Like I write all of the Dune books with Brian Herbert. I mean, he's Frank Herbert's son. Together we come up with something that is set and belongs on the shelf, we hope, with the original Dune books. And I've written 35, 40 books with my wife, Rebecca Mesta, and she's a young adult author. So we do YA stuff that I wouldn't normally write myself, but she's good with the little touchy-feely relationship stuff. And
need somebody for that.
Exactly. Scott and I are big collaborators, as are some of a lot of the authors that watch this show. I want to talk, kind of dive deep and a little bit into that here in the second half of the show. But first, I want to talk about the show sponsor this week before we get too in depth into that. And this week, it's Scott's book, Blade of the Reaper, because it just came out yesterday, and it's riding high on the Amazon charts right now. Blade of the Reaper is the third book in the Last Reaper series by Scott and Jeff Chaney. Halek Cain's journey has only just begun. In search of answers to both his past and his future, Hal and his newly formed crew must overcome obstacles unlike anything they've ever seen. Hal needs repairs, and there's only so many places a Reaper can find them. Far across known space, hidden inside an uncharted slip tunnel, a hidden Reaper facility may hold the answer Hal needs. But the Union would rather the dead stay buried, and they'll kill to keep their secrets. I should have had you read your own blurb, Scott.
I didn't write the blurb, actually. So.
That is The Blade of the Reaper, which is the third book in the Last Reaper series. They're soaring up the charts. It's 1,100 in the store right now, so it's very good for day 2, and it's number 1 in its category. So congratulations, Scott.
Not too shabby. Thank you.
Not too shabby. Go and pick it up, Blade of the Reaper. I'll put the link in the live chat. Also be in the show notes.
We could talk about collaborations, and I'll give my little 2 cents briefly. That's one that I tried to finish before I went to Napa. And I rushed the ending, and so then I got the news that it needed to be a lot of it rewritten, and that was agonizing when you think you're done and you're on a schedule because you're trying to turn out stuff pretty fast, and it was very painful for me. And that's why Josh probably has a therapist bill from all the times I called him, going, "What the hell am I doing? I'm dying here." But then it got done, and I'm really actually glad we did the revisions because it was a little bit longer, the story's a little bit deeper, the characters were more consistent. So, but we'd love to talk more.
But you're bringing up an interesting point here that I kind of want to hammer home as sort of the old man in the mountain here, has been around for a long time. Is I used to be like, I was called a hack because I wrote like 3 or 4 books a year, that nobody could write that fast. Nobody could stand that much. And in fact, as a as a reader when I was just starting out. You guys might not remember this, but I don't remember what year it was, early 80s, I think, that Stephen King wrote a book called The Talisman with Peter Straub. A big fat book, this Talisman. And the same year, Stephen King came out with The Eyes of the Dragon, a second hardcover book. And I remember reading a story in Publishers Weekly that only an author like Stephen King could think his readers would buy 2 books by the same author in 1 year. And that was broke the back of publishing, that Stephen King wrote 2 books in 1 year.
That's crazy talk.
And then that's crazy talk. And then a lot of writers in my generation, especially the media tie-in writers, and I wrote for X-Files and Star Trek and all kinds of things. We always wrote a handful of books a year. Now, for me, well, when I was writing the young adult Star Wars Young Jedi Knight series, those were short books, like 45,000 word books. And I was writing those and writing my original stuff and doing some other things. I think I had a year that I maybe had 8 or 9 books out, but that was like really blowing the gaskets. And I think a couple of more under pen names. But what indie authors have done that I don't think traditional publishing has quite got their heads around it yet. I mean, I know plenty of indie authors that are just on the clock for a book a month, 12 books a year, or even more than that. Yep. And that kind of pace, I mean, you guys are going to burn out. This is really, really a high productivity thing. And there's got to be a balance between getting it as fast as the readers want it, but also giving them the in-depth, don't rush your endings, get the characters right so that they will want to read the next one. And I mean, we'll go back to our Game of Thrones Twitter arguments. Look what everybody's screaming about it. And I'll scream too about how that they just rushed everything in the last 6 episodes. Yeah. And they probably had 2 or 3 years worth of episodes that they could have milked. I don't mean milked in a bad way, but they could have developed that story. But it was just like, bam, the Night King's gone in 1 episode. Bam, Daenerys is done in 1 episode. Bam. I mean, everything is just, no, you want to spend your time to do something.
They could have 3 spin-off series running concurrently for years with the depth of those books they want.
So I had a conversation with somebody just this morning about this last season and kind of the if you haven't seen it, sorry, spoilers, not really, but the flip that Daenerys does this season, and you know,
that needed some more episodes to develop that character.
Right,
arc.
exactly. And my point was that you could have taken, 10 minutes off the battle scene at Winterfell. You could have taken 10 minutes off the battle scene at King's Landing. You could have taken 20 minutes from episode 2 when it was all the character building arcs in Winterfell before the battle happened. I mean, almost a whole hour's worth of stuff, and then wrap that into Dany going crazy. And just because at the end of season 6, she loses her dragon, but at the very beginning, or season 7, sorry, she loses her dragon, and then at the beginning of season 8, she's flying around having happy good time picnics with Jon. Like you could have just locked into the tragedy of the dragon dying and carrying that all the way through, and that broker, and just hammer it all the way through until the end, and that would have made it a believable arc for Dany to go crazy in 1 season. But I like you said, they rushed it, and I thought the rest of the series was good. Obviously, different from the books, and I've read the books twice, and I love the books, and I can't wait to hopefully see how he ends it. But
someday,
yeah,
in Dreamland.
Well, I think now it's even more imperative that he writes the books, and so that we can, even if he tells the same story, just fleshing it out in George sense. Now that George Martin also, George is a friend of mine. I've known him for 20 some years. But that's kind of the opposite. I was talking about indies writing 12 books a year, and it's just really pushing them out. Well, writing 1 book every 12 years is also kind of the opposed end of that spectrum.
Yeah,
right.
And you need to produce books as fast as your maybe not as fast as your readers want them, because they want them every week or something like that. But fast enough so that the readers will stay with you, but also give yourself enough time to do what you think is your best work. And that is something that I I really push in all of my writing seminars and the classes that I teach is that you really always have to do your very best work, because no matter what you write, that piece is going to be somebody's first introduction to your writing. And if you just phoned it in, they're going to pick it up and go, I don't like Kevin Anderson's work because this felt like it was rushed and not polished. But you need to do your best possible work. But on the other hand, there's Mike Resnick is a science fiction short fiction author. He's won more Hugo and Nebula Awards than any other writer in the history of science fiction. and he and I talked about editing and getting how good it was, and I said that, after 3 or 4 drafts, I've got a short story about 95% as good as it's ever going to be. So I can either do 4 more drafts and maybe kick it up to 98%, or I can spend that much time writing a brand new story and getting that one 95%. And Mike Resnick, the guy who's won all these awards, said, yeah, there's a point of diminishing returns. You do 3 or 4 edits, it's as good as it's going to be. And any more editing you do to it, nobody's going to notice but you.
Right.
There's definitely that chance. And I think sometimes I think writing, like doing the dictation and moving quickly is good for the creative process as well, because I think there's a myth that the slower you go, the better it will be. Sometimes moving quickly gets you at least into the framework and stuff like that.
Well, sometimes the energy that comes out, if I'm in like this big space battle scene, man, I'm talking that's why I'm glad I'm not typing, because I can talk faster than I can type, and I can get these things out. And just the power in the words that I'm writing about the spaceships, the aliens, the dragon attacking, the action scenes. I mean, I don't need to be precious about every word. I want the reader to forget that they're reading, that they should be so caught up and engaged in the drama of what's going on. And that energy comes through when you, the writer, are engaged in it and pushing it out.
I could see myself with a recorder walking down the street and like having sword battles with no one while I'm yelling at people in the lines of the characters that I'm telling the story.
Well, that's why I go out in the forest.
Make that call.
Do this.
Yeah.
I'd probably get sent to that call. Start for a suspicious character.
Right. Lauren Moore asks, do you happen to know George's take on good and evil? Like, and I'm curious to see what your take is on fantasy. Like, especially with fantasy, you look at good versus evil, but we talk about Game of Thrones, and there's really a fine line between good and evil, and it's more in the gray area than anything.
Well, I mean, when I've talked with George, I don't say, "Hey, George, let's sit down with the beer and talk about good versus evil." I mean, that's
Indeed.
not really our conversation. I mean, it's even I say, George, when's the next book coming?
Yeah. Why don't you start dictating instead of writing in WordStar?
Yeah, there we go. But for me, I mean, I think that's a very important concept, because I think stories are boring when you have Dudley Do-Right and Snidely Whiplash. I mean, I don't believe in the completely evil villain and the completely virtuous hero. They're just not that interesting. And in fact, I like to tell a lot of my stories are from both sides of a war, and of course each side thinks the other one's wrong. And when you get into the head of one character, you can follow through his logic or her logic about what I mean. If you wrote a story, I'm sure countless people have done it. I haven't read it, but an Israeli versus Palestinian epic story. I mean, if you told the Palestinian point of view, they would think the Israelis are the bad guys, and vice versa. I mean, if you do it, no bad guy thinks he's the bad guy.
Right.
And so you have to get into the minds of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And like in my Spine of the Dragon, I've got this ancient race that is literally trying to wake the dragon, which will destroy the world. But they're doing it because that's the only way they believe the world can be remade in a perfect way, so that they can have their paradise. Kind of like why there was the flood, then so that the 2 animals except for the unicorns could be saved. But I mean,
which I think is the biggest tragedy ever.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what we don't
in
have
this case, I mean, you've got this race that literally is aiming to destroy the world, but they think they're doing the right thing because it'll turn out right in the end. And of course, all the humans
long term
killed is like, well, maybe this isn't the best for us if you do that. And of course, instead of fighting the ancient race, they decide to fight each other because humans hate each other more than they can hate the outside enemy. And I don't know.
So I'm curious with with this new series, is it, you mentioned there's a lot of characters. Do you have multiple POVs? Do you have like one character for each side? Do you do both sides, or do you just focus on one? And if you do both, I know you say you're a plotter. Do you stick with that one side through beginning to end, or do you bounce back and forth between?
No, this is each and everything. I've got probably 35 point of view characters, and they're from all aspects of the conflict, from the like I said, from the kings to the lowly foot soldiers, and the neutral gypsy clans, and the evil ancient race, and we've got all kinds of people and all different things, and they of course interact, and it's, to me, the plotting is the coolest part. It's like being a symphony conductor, and you've got all these instruments that you got to get playing at the right time so that what comes out sounds like this great concert.
I like, it's interesting because I love those big expansive books, and I try to split my time going back and forth between simpler books and then the big sweeping books, and we're talking about collaborations, but also, like you say, you do some franchise writing too, like with Star Wars and those things. Did you ever find it, do you find it easier or harder when you're doing your own stuff, or when you're doing like something like Star Wars, where you've got to write in somebody else's framework of a for instance, not call it a magic system, but the Force and everything that happens in Star Wars, rather than just create your own?
Well, I mean, I'm a fanboy. I mean, I grew up watching Star Trek and Lost in Space and running around playing Space 1999 when I was in like junior high. So I can really get into like writing, role playing, and playing in some of these other universes. But there are problems. I mean, sometimes the universe doesn't make sense. If you like really, really dig into it, there are some things where I won't mention which ones I'm talking about, but I've had to do some work in the. No, I will tell you one that I didn't do. I mean, the Transformers tried to hire me to write some novels, and I started digging into it, and I just went, I just can't make heads or tails out of this as to how it fits together, and I turned them down, and they got somebody else to write it. But for me, when I'm writing my own Saga of Seven Sons or Spine of the Dragon, I get to make it all up. I get to do everything I want.
Sure.
But on the other hand, when I write Star Wars, it comes with an intrinsic fan base of 29 trillion people who are going to.
We're very vocal and all have access to the internet.
Well, and they've all got their opinions. But like if I say Han Solo and Chewbacca flew the Millennium Falcon to Tatooine, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
Imagine if this was my own series where I had my own captain and my own co-pilot, my own ship, and my own planet. You wouldn't know the guy's character. You wouldn't know what the alien is. You wouldn't know what the ship looked like. You wouldn't know what the planet is. And so I have to give you all that stuff. And It's a lot more work for me as an author, because when you're a Star Wars fan and you read a Star Wars book, you already know what the universe is and how it works. But then it's my job to make sure that you get the droids you're looking for. I mean, you have to get that kind of
nicely done.
Absolutely.
Nicely done.
Well done. That was pro.
But on the other hand, when you're dealing with well, actually the Lucasfilm people were really pretty good with me, but some of the other ones, licensors, they can be nuts. I mean, this wasn't me, but Vonda McIntyre wrote the novelization for Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. And they gave her the script, but they left off the last 10 pages because nobody was supposed to know that Spock dies. And so she gets to the end of the script and she's writing the book, and they go, well, I need the last pages of the script, and they wouldn't give it to her. So well, it's embargoed. Nobody can see it. She says, how do I write the book? And that's sometimes the things you deal with when you're working with licensors or Hollywood people, that they have different things. And I do know that one other One other author writing in a popular franchise had to rewrite a section of his book because it had to coordinate with a new action figure line that they were trying to release in the toy stores. So that's not the kind of plotting that you normally would have to worry about. But I mean, you get paid well, we hope, and lots of people read it. And I got a lot of my readers from the Star Wars fans. I still get people coming up that they've named their kids after characters in my books, and you know, they tell stories, and I made a lot of fans that way. And some of them will pick up Spine of the Dragon, or some of them pick up the Dune books, or some of them read my Seven Sons. And you know, as these days, readers, you need to grab every reader you can get. And
what's your favorite genre of the two, science fiction or fantasy, to write in?
Well, I guess it depends on what story I want to tell. I mean, it's not really easy. Although I've written science fiction for so long that when I did my Terra Incognita fantasy trilogy, which was the one I did before Spine of the Dragon, it's sailing ships and sea monsters in the Crusades, and I was like Jerry Purnell, big science fiction author, who was a friend of mine. He used to go on these rants about how science fiction was hard because it had to be fact-based and science-based, and fantasy, you just make it all up. And then I start writing my fantasy about sailing ships and sea monsters, and all of a sudden I'm realizing that fantasy is hard, because in science fiction I could just make up whether they have Ansible communication that's faster than light transmissions, and it's Plaz, that's the transparent metal that they look through in the starship hull, and but if you're writing fantasy, it's like it was an Arabic desert country that was exploring and trying to sail the seas, and then we had to go, well, wait, if they're building all these ships, where are they getting the wood if they got a bunch of sand dunes, and how do they make the rope, and where does the iron come from for the mines, and how do they do that, and do they have gunpowder, and do they have the printing press, and if they're sailing, how do they navigate, and if they don't have clocks, then they can't calculate longitude, and you know, you don't worry about stuff like that in science fiction, because Mr. Sulu at the helm knows where they're navigating to, and
absolutely.
You know, so that to me was a little bit different, and well, especially with fantasy. If you've got, say, something's the size of the United States, your fantasy world is the size of the United States, but you don't have telephones. And so if your king gets murdered in Washington, D.C., how does your character in California find out about it? Well, about 2 years later is how they find out about it. Right. And that's a lot harder to make your fast-paced story happen if nobody knows what happened 20 days ride away. So then you make up a race of magical telepaths that can just transmit their news or something like that, which then become characters, and you have to build them up and develop that magic system, and that's how you solve your problems.
I love reading. I always used to be a science fiction, and I still write military science fiction. Grew up kind of reading David Weber and those Michael Crichton and those type of books. But now I'm making kind of the turn into just reading fantasy all the time. I love like just the big sweeping magic systems and Game of Thrones and the Sanderson.
Oh, I love it when somebody else has to write it. So
yeah.
I like
that. You know, the thing I like about fantasy is it's the place you can go, you can imagine yourself into the story and kind of muck around in there and do things. And that's, you know, in those huge world building things, you can live in the story. That's why I don't really care if George ever finished it. I don't really care, because I'll just like going there and daydreaming.
Well, I'd still rather he finished it, because I still want to read the rest of it. But
yeah.
But I want to actually throw in there that George. I've been a fan of George's fiction long before Game of Thrones. I mean, he wrote Fever Dream, was this fantastic book about a vampire riverboat captain on the Mississippi River in the 1800s, and that was fantastic. And the Armageddon Rag was like this horror thing about rock and roll music and zombies and horror, and that was wonderful. And Sand Kings was a fantastic story, and Night Flyers and Windhaven. He wrote like really, really good stuff. So there's more to George Martin than just Game of Thrones.
He wrote for TV quite a bit too, didn't he?
Yeah, he was working on the Beauty and the Beast TV series. He was working on the new Twilight Zone TV series, and I forget what else he was working on. But he's been around in science fiction for quite a long time. So check out some of his backlist while you're waiting for the next Game of Thrones. You have time to read all of his other books.
Yeah. It seems like to be, especially even before the indie world there, that to be a full-time writer, like you said, you made your living at it for 30 years or something, you have to be prolific and you have to be writing in lots of different projects and constantly be looking for work in a positive sense, which I'm not sure, because outside of, like, when I tell somebody I'm a writer, they're like, well, you just need that one big book. You need your one break. And that's a myth.
Yeah. I mean,
usually.
Maybe you could write like Jurassic Park and make enough money to retire on afterwards, but that doesn't really happen. And we've got, even now, I mean, I've got Spine of the Dragon is from Tor. I've got several other books coming out from Tor Books. I've got this audible.com stake, the vampire serial killer one. I've got those traditional things. I've got a bunch of my own indie. Wordfire Press is my publishing house. We've got 350 titles out from like 95 authors, and we do those in trade paperback and hardcovers and ebooks and audiobooks, and then we market all that and we make some money that way. And every year, my wife and I and a bunch of other best-selling authors run something called the Superstars Writing Seminar in Colorado Springs. We just had in fact, we're working up our 11th one right now, and that's very balanced, traditional and indie, but it's about the business of writing and building your career and understanding copyright and intellectual property and marketing methods and all that. That's in Colorado Springs. We get 250 people come every year. We've had Jim Butcher, Brandon Sanderson, Eric Flint, David Farland. We've had Sherilyn Kenyon, Tracy Hickman. I mean, and also those are just the authors, and we've had editors from Tor Books and HarperCollins and Baen Books and Bantam Books and Del Rey and all kinds of major publishers. And we've had New York literary agents. We've had the head of audible.com and Kobo and all these people in the industry coming, and people just learn how to do that. And the reason I mention is we run that every year so that's another income stream for us. And I've just got hired. I'm a professor at Western Colorado University. I'm running an entire grad program, the master's degree in publishing, which is, I think, the only one of its kind, which is
very cool.
Literally, it's a one-year master's program. You get your degree in publishing, and it is 50% indie, 50% traditional. And students go through, and in fact, one of the things that we have the students do is they brainstorm an anthology that they're going to edit, and they put out the marketing call, and they solicit the submissions. They read the slush pile. They pick the stories. We got a grant from Draft to Digital to pay so that we can pay 6 cents a word professional rates for the anthology, so that they're actually paying for the stories. They're writing the contracts, and then they're going to edit it. They're going to lay them all out in vellum. They're going to design the cover. They're going to release the book in hardcover and audio and paperback and ebook, and it'll be out with their name on the cover. And so it's like real hands-on. And then that's their group project. And for their individual project, we're having them, they each find some out of copyright classic, some old, I don't know, Jules Verne book or something, that they will acquire it and they'll get the text, and that they themselves will produce the whole book start to finish, and it'll come out with their name on the copyright page as the production editor. And then Wordfire Press, my publishing house, will release them, so they'll actually be out by a mid-sized publisher. And that's in Western Colorado University. Look up the graduate program in creative writing, and you'll see it. I can give you a link if you want to put it on your show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Absolutely.
This is the first year, and I'm running that. But the reason I say all this is that I don't just write a book and get paid, and that's how I make my living. That there's all kinds of diverse income streams. That the publishing world is so volatile these days that I used to be able to count on just writing all the time and making my living at it. And who knows? I mean, audio's taking off right now, but print books, I don't even want to make predictions because it all sound silly, but you can't count on the same thing being valid this year as it was 5 years ago or 5 years from now. And I kind of would like to be able to keep buying groceries and paying for my insurance and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's interesting because, you're not an unknown name in the publishing industry, if I can say that.
Yes, you can say
Huge.
You say science fiction or you say Dune and Kevin J. Anderson, you say Star Wars, you know Kevin J. Anderson.
We talked about how many. Go ahead.
Same thing with David Weber. David Weber, and he's also looking at getting into kind of the indie new pub kind of space. And so are a lot of other authors that have been predominantly traditional. But there's so many other people that are kind of, I don't want to say stuck in the past, but that just they don't see or don't want to see the viability or the changing of the tides and just the different aspects that come along with this new digital realm of publishing. And it's very cool to see authors like yourself getting into kind of the whole authorpreneur type, where you're doing publishing, you're doing all these different collaborations, helping other authors get their names out there and produce their books and stuff. That's very cool that you're taking all that on, because you could just sit and write and do things if you wanted to, but it's good to see that. It's fun to see that kind of stuff happen.
Well, I wish I didn't have to. I mean, at I'm 57. I really wish I didn't have to learn everything all over again. I kind of wanted to just like write books and tell people to get off my lawn. But but I also want to keep writing and I want to keep making a living at it. I mean, not just in a mercenary sense, but I want to not be, oh yeah, didn't he used to write books? I mean, I want to still be around and still be writing stuff that people want to read.
One of the questions that Scott likes to ask, and I'm going to steal it, is the new series that you have, Spine of the Dragon. What's your favorite secondary character in that series that you like to write?
Well, I've got this one. It's an orphan girl who just basically loves to wander the earth. She's completely independent. She's like 12 years old. I guess, now that I'm thinking of it, it's kind of like an Arya character but her family wasn't killed by the evil Lannisters or something. She's just, in fact, I don't think I even ever said what happened to her parents, because she's with like these wandering Fremen gypsy tribes, and they all kind of take care of each other, and they've just sort of adopted her, and whenever she comes to their camp, they feed her, but she kind of likes to be off by herself, and she's getting visions of dragons, like really powerful visions, and she doesn't know what they mean, and she thinks something's really wrong going on with the world, but nobody will believe her, and she's trying to figure it out by herself. And she's got one little storyline going through that's connecting with all these other storylines, but she's just kind of like this spunky kid. And I mean, I alluded to it a little bit. I mean, I live in Colorado. I've done 26-mile hikes in a day. I go to places where I won't see another human being for all day long. I mean, I'm just out in the middle, and if I broke my leg, I'd be really toast. And I mean, I'm self-reliant, and I'm confident enough, and I know what I'm doing. And if I get lost, I kind of know how to do landmarks and read a topo map. And there's a part of me in her where she just like, it'll all turn out right. She's going to go over and see what's in those mountains over there. And it might take her 10 days to get there, but it's going to be cool when she gets there. And her name is Glick, just because it was this little nickname and nobody really knows what her last name is. And she was sort of, those kids that are sort of feral and just raised by the whole neighborhood. Well, that's kind of who she is. And I enjoy her. And of course, because I enjoyed her so much, I did some really, really bad crap to her at the end of the first book.
Of course. Because you care.
Because I care. Yeah.
Because you care.
It's for the best.
Yes.
I'm saying that in the best possible way.
Yes.
Yeah. It's going to hurt me a lot more than it's going to hurt you.
So we'll do this again. Spine of the Dragon.
Yeah. Spine of the Dragon. That's fact, right.
My website is wordfire.com, WORDFIRE.com. And I just, the whole front page of that, I did what I hope is a nice thing is I put pre-order buttons, but I put them to all different bookstores, not just Amazon. Amazon's, of course, the big 900-pound gorilla. But if you don't want to buy it from Amazon, there's other links that are there too. but you guys all know, I mean, pre-order if you can. We want you to pre-order because that makes people pay attention to it when it does come out. So
I put the link in the live chat, and it'll be in the show notes as well. And we mentioned it earlier, but I really love that cover. I meant to say it when we were talking about it, but you
Sometimes we
mentioned
talk a lot
having
about covers.
yeah, you mentioned having the magicians with the big cities and the people with magic. And sometimes a simple something like a sword and the dragon scales is just so simple that it says so much. And those are some of the best covers, I think.
you know that's a comedy romance right by looking at it.
Right.
Exactly what I was thinking. Matter of fact, I'm gonna
Exactly what I was thinking.
pre-order it right now. So here we
Werewolf
go.
active romance. So
Click, click.
Kevin,
All right,
thanks
so
so
I
much
made
for
a
coming
sale.
on the
It's been
show.
worth doing this whole hour for.
There you
That's
go.
right.
There you go.
made one sale this whole time. Thanks so much for coming on the show. It was a blast to have you on. You're coming actually back on the writer's journey. What day?
In like a week or so after Spine of the Dragon comes out, so I can repeat myself there.
That's right. The
Show more book covers.
13th of June is when you're coming on.
That's because I ran into her at where was it? Awesome Con in Washington D.C. We were waiting in line to pay far too much for a prepackaged sub sandwich,
Right.
and we got to talking about that she knew you guys, and because a new book's coming out, you say yes, I'd love to be on your podcast. So
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
got to do my part. So all right.
Lauren and Kayleen are great. So, yeah, thanks for coming on. Everybody that was in the live chat, thank you guys for coming and hanging out with us. If you're new to the show tonight, don't forget to subscribe and like our channel. If you're listening on the podcast feed, come and hang out with us on Mondays and Thursdays live on YouTube and join the shenanigans. We will come back next week. We're going to have some reading talk. We're going to have some writing talk, and we're going to talk about everything else in between right here on Keystroke Medium. You guys have a good night.
Still